Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here as part of Drisha's Elul program. My name is Michael Fraud. I'm the Assistant Program Director and really thrilled to have you all here this evening. We are here tonight for the third class of the Kapparah of Yom Kippur with Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Zuckier, who is our Education Director here at Drisha, as well as a postdoctoral fellow at McGill University. The class so far has been focused on the overarching idea of how atonement comes about on Yom Kippur. We have looked at some texts from Vayikra as well as some texts from Masechet Yoma that look at various ways that one might conceive of the atonement that we do on Yom Kippur, how exactly it works, whether we have to do anything or whether it happens automatically, various other questions. Tonight's Shiur is going to be focused on the relationship between Yom Kippur and the Seir HaMishtaleach, the scapegoat that would help atone for sin when it was brought back in the times of the Beit HaMikdash. So the class is going to be asking about the relationship between atonement and Yom Kippur as a day of atonement and the scapegoat or various other Yom Kippur sacrifices, both in the time of the temple and in today's times. So without further ado, let's get started.
All right, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you everyone for being here and for having a chance to learn together. So as I think Michael mentioned, in previous weeks we spoke about the relationship between Yom Kippur and Chuva, how those two factors work together nowadays in terms of getting Kaphara, in terms of earning atonement. And there was a lot of interesting things last week. We're going to continue that discussion, but move things a little bit back in history. Go back to the time of the Beis HaMikdash when there were Korbanos, and to think about how Kaphara happened then. And Shuva is still an option, at least in theory, but the thing we're going to focus on more, the thing that the sources focus on more, and there in the chat, there's a link to the source sheet, so everyone should be able to access that there. What the sources focus on more is the relation between the day of Yom Kippur on the one hand, and the Korbanos, the sacrifices of Yom Kippur on the other hand. And by sacrifices, I'm using that term loosely because it includes the Seir HaMishtaleach, the scapegoat, which is sort of a korban, sort of not a korban, and not a standard korban, certainly. So the question is, what role exactly is there? What's the balance in terms of Kaphara and Yom Kippur? How much of the work is accomplished by the Seir, by the scapegoat, and by the other korbanos, and how much is accomplished by the day? Once we understand the answer to that, that will help us compare what Kaphara was like in the time of the Beis HaMikdash to what it's like today. Because the more of a role that the korbanos then had, the more they're obviously missing today, right? Whereas if you minimize the role of those korbanos in the Seir HaMishtaleach, we don't really have as much that's missing, at least at first glance. So we're going to jump in to some of these sugyas and analyze those questions. And there's really a lot to do today, so it's possible this topic will carry over to next week. But we'll do our best to get through as much of it as we can. And we'll start by picking up with the Mishnah that we studied in great detail last time. The Mishnah in Yoma Pehem Beis, source number 1 on the handout. And again, I'm going to do screen share. Everyone is encouraged to come on screen yourselves for a classroom feeling. But for now, we'll screen share. I can still see a good number of you on the side, and you can certainly see each other if you change the setup. You can do that too. In any event, let's jump in. Source number 1: Chatas ve'asham vadai mechaprin. Right, the Mishnah tells us that in general, a chatas and the standard asham, those korbanos are mechaper, they atone, and you bring those korbanos when you do an avera of a certain type. You bring the korban, you get kapara. That's obviously talking about in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. Nowadays, we don't have the option of bringing korbanos. The continuation of the Mishnah, misav Yom Kippurim mechaper imat Shuva, death or Yom Kippur, either of those is mechaper, atones for one's averos along with Shuva. We discussed this in great detail last time. Is it really Yom Kippur doing the work? Is it really Shuva doing the work? Do you need both? We spent a lot of time on that. But what's clear is that all of these things seem to apply nowadays, right? Death still exists as far as I can tell. Yom Kippur still exists. Certainly Chuva still exists. So these are all contemporary options of Kapparah. And then the Mishnah continues how exactly that works. We'll now look, source number 2 is what's known as Arba'a Chiluke Kapparah, a teaching of Rabbi Yishmael about 4 types of Kapparah that apply, 4 categories of things that yield Kapparah, that yield atonement, that all of which exist nowadays, and really building on the Mishnah in a sense. And there's parallels to this in the Mechilta and in the Bavli and Yerushalmi. We're not going to read all the sources. This is a very clear formulation of Rabbi Yishmael's teaching. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Arba'a Chiluke Kapparah Hein. There's 4 categories of atonement. And he says it in this like absolute way, right? These are the 4 atonements. And we're going to see he leaves out things like Korbanos, presumably because he's talking about Kapparah that exists nowadays. So what are the 4 Kapparahs that exist nowadays? And just a moment, we'll zoom in for additional ease of reading. So what are the 4 categories of Kapparah? If one violates a mitzvah say, one misses out on a positive commandment, all you need to do is tshuva. So category 1 is tshuva, and you get atonement for that. It should be. That's category 1. Tshuva alone works in some cases. Category number 2. If you violate a negative command, which is more severe, tshuva tolav Yom Kippur and Chuva sort of lets the avera hang in the balance. It suspends the avera, and Yom Kippur does the rest of the job of atonement. And that's really the same as the line in the Mishnah. That's category 2, right? Where you have tshuva is not enough, you need Yom Kippur in addition. Category number 3, if you violate a severe prohibition, which has kares or misos bezdin, tshuva, you do tshuva. So tshuva v'Yom Kippur and tolin, tshuva plus Yom Kippur are not enough. They just suspend the avera v'yisurin shev'shari mos hashanim emarkin. The suffering that one experiences the rest of the year, that serves to atone for it. So we have our 3rd type of atonement here, our 3rd atoning entity, which is yisurin, suffering. This does not appear explicitly in the Mishnah, but it's in our Tosefta here, and it's quoted many times later. And then we have what we saw in the Gemara last time as Rebbe's teaching of Mishnah Shem Shemayim, a mazid, or a version of it. If one intentionally makes a chilul Hashem, ve'asa tshuva, ein balo b'tshuva lislos, v'lo mechaper, Yom Kippur, tshuva and Yom Kippur are not enough if you make a chilul Hashem. El tshuva Yom Kippur mechaperim shlish. Tshuva plus Yom Kippur atone a 3rd. Yisurin mechaperim shlish. Suffering atones another 3rd. Remisam imarekes ima yisurin. And then death does the final cleansing. Lamarik is to cleanse, which here means to atone, along with suffering. So you put all 4 of them together, are 4 categories. Tshuva, Yom Kippur, suffering, and death. You put the 4 of them together, and you get Kapparah through that. And finally, you get Kapparah. And then we quote a pasuk. We quote a pasuk there. That's our story, right? Those are the 4 categories of Kapparah. And then the next line in the Tosefta, this is not arguing with Rabbi Yishmael, but it sounds like it is. Rabbi Yishmael says these are the 4 categories of Kapparah. The next line is chadas ve'asham, etc. are only mechaper along with tshuva. So it mentions chadas and asham. So what about them? Why are they not part of the list? The answer is, it seems that Rabbi Yishmael is talking about nowadays, the 4 categories of Kapparah nowadays. Bisman HaMikdash, in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, there are other categories such as chatas and asham, among others. And that the rest of that Tosefta quotes part of the discussion we saw in our Gemara last time. We're not going to go back to that, although it is a fascinating discussion, as some of you know from last week. But we're going to move forward. We're going to look at other sugyas that discuss how Kapparah works on Yom Kippur in the time of the Beis HaMikdash that will allow us to make this comparison, to say, okay, what existed, what was necessary for Kapparah in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, what's necessary today, and what changed in the process. And by doing that, we're going to be asking first, what's the relationship between the day of Yom Kippur, which obviously still exists today, and the Korbanos brought on Yom Kippur, including the Sir Mishtaleach, which we obviously don't do today. So that's our task for the next 49 or so minutes. So the place to start is this extended Mishnah. It's really a whole parak of Mishnah that starts off Maseches Shavuos. Maseches Shavuos is about oaths, And for some reason, it's a funny coincidence. For some reason, the first couple of prakim have nothing at all to do with Shavuos. And it's because we start off with this mnemonic, Shavuos Shtaim Shein Arba. There's a 2, which is 4, that relates to Shavuos. And that reminds us that we remind ourselves of other things that are 2 that are 4, one of which is Yedios Hatuma Shtaim Shein Arba. Scenarios where one becomes impure and realizes that impurity has a Yedias Hatuma, has knowledge of the fact that they were impure. There's 2 categories that split into a total of 4 categories. And then we spend a whole parak talking about that, and before we end up getting to Shavuos itself. So our discussion now is going to be based on that scenario. We're not going to get into the details of Tumah and how it works. There's a lot more to discuss there. We're just going to focus on the description of the Korbanos, because the basic idea here is most Kapparah, most atonement for averos of Tumah, of where one, let's say, becomes Tameh, doesn't realize they're Tameh. Let's say it becomes Tameh to a dead body, walks over a grave, doesn't realize they did that, and goes into the Beis HaMikdash. That defiles the temple in one sense or another. That's Matame the Mikdash, whatever that means. Not clear you need to actually be Matame the Mikdash, but it's prohibited to do that. You have to bring a special Korban for that, really different Korbanos in different scenarios. So we're going to discuss all of that, but all of that atonement happens on Yom Kippur. So that's the scenario we're talking about here, or really the 4 scenarios. So scenario number 1, a scenario where you knew about the impurity originally, and then you forgot. And then you went to the Beis HaMikdash, and then you remembered again. Seir Nasa Bifnim v'Yom Kippurim Tole. A combination, it sounds like, of the Seir Nasa Bifnim, the Karban Chatas, the goat that's brought as a Chatas offering, that's brought on Yom Kippur, Bifnim, inside of the Kodesh, where the blood's taken inside, that v'Yom Kippurim and Yom Kippur together, Tole. They suspend the Avera, they take care of it at least partially. Once you realize fully that you were impure, you bring out Olav Yored. That's scenario 1. Scenario 2, if you had knowledge at the beginning, and that, you didn't have knowledge at the beginning, but you did have knowledge at the end that you were impure, in that case, a different, the Seir Nasa B'chutz, the other Seir Chatas brought in Yom Kippur, that's brought outside, that's brought in the Azara, that atones along with Yom Kippur. And then if you have knowledge neither at the beginning nor the end, in that case, other chatases brought on other days, on the Shalosh Regalim, on Rosh Chodesh, those are mechaper. That's Rehuda's position. There's a whole dispute. We're going to get into the details of all that. What's important for us is the underlying parts, which is in each of these cases, whatever kapara happens from these goats, these are not the scapegoat, these are not the Seir Mishnah, that's a normal carbon chatas, one brought inside, one brought outside. But what's sort of interesting here in terms of how it works? How many components are necessary in each of these cases that are underlined? Right. Let's take the first case. So what's needed to be tole to temporarily suspend this avera? What does it sound like?
It looks like it's 2.
Looks like it's 2 things, right? The chatas that you bring inside the kodesh, number 1. Number 2, the day of Yom Kippur. Those 2 factors are necessary to work together to be mechaper, right? That's what sounds like it's happening here. And the same for all the other cases. Seir Nasa B'chutz v'Yom Kippur mechaper, right? The other chatas plus Yom Kippur, Seir Regalim. There's no Yom Kippur there, so we don't say that. But notice what we don't say here. We don't say Seir Haregalim v'Haregel. Right, we don't say the carbon you bring, the carbon chatas you bring on Shavuos, not the name of the Sefta Shavuos, the other Shavuos. Right, we don't say that chatas plus the day of Shavuos is mechaper. There's no such thing, right? You say the carbon itself is enough on the Seir Regalim, Seir Chodashim. Only on Yom Kippur do we have this idea that v'Yom Kippurim, the day itself, participates. And similarly later on, well, this one here, it's actually not as clear. It says v'shel Yom Kippurim mechaper. The chatas of Yom Kippur atones. We don't specify that Yom Kippur itself joins in. And then at the end, this is interesting, a very important line here. This may be the most important line of the whole Mishnah, of this whole Shiur, which is the alzdon tumas mikdash v'kadshav. If you intentionally defile the mikdash, you become tameh and enter the mikdash. In such a case, seir nasa b'fnim v'yom kippurim v'chaprim. Fine, this line, we're not yet at the most important line, it's still an important line. The Shiur brought inside plus Yom Kippur are mechaper. And now al shar averos shebatorah, all other averos in the whole Torah, hakalos v'chamuros, minor or severe, azdonos v'ashgogos, intentional violation or unintending violation, hoda v'lo hoda, if you realize afterwards that you did it or not, ase v'lo sase, positive or negative violation, karesos mises bezdin, even if it's severe, where you get excision or the death penalty. In all of those cases, every single avera in the whole Torah, siyar mishtaleach mechaper, the goat that's sent out, the scapegoat is mechaper, atones for you in such a case. So what's really important about this line? What's interesting? What's unusual? What's important? There's a lot of things to say about this line. What do people think? What do people think? Yeah, Talia?
First of all, it's just a single thing. There's not two things mentioned. There's like no mention of Chuva. Also, it's pretty radical. It falls more into the category that we were talking about last week of this more like miraculous gift that we're getting.
Okay, great. So yeah, I think a great point that it's only Sir Mishtaleach, and there are two things we might have said work with it, but they're not mentioned here. One is the day of Yom Kippur, right, which we know from earlier in the Mishnah seems like that's a thing, but it's not mentioned here. So the day of Yom Kippur seems like it has no role. It's just the Shiur without the day. And then, as you emphasized, no tshuva. Doesn't say anything about tshuva. Now maybe it's lurking in the, maybe it implies it, but it definitely doesn't sound like you need tshuva here. It sounds like the Sir Mishtaleach is mechaper, automatically, magically even. And that would fit well with this idea we have from the Mishnah in Yoma that tells us that there would be a red string, and they'd rip it in half. Half they'd put on the Sir Mishtaleach's horn, half they'd put on the Beis HaMikdash, and when the seer died, the string would turn white to show that there was this basically automatic Kaphara, right? Everyone's sins, all the red turned to white. Everyone became pure again. That sounds like, that miracle that would happen would correlate with a conception of atonement there, that it's miraculous, right? That it's sort of totally without human input. It's just the seer itself that does it. And this line really lends itself to that, right? It's such an extreme line. All of errors in the Torah, except for Tumas Mikdash V'Kadsha, right? Except for becoming Tamei and entering the Beis HaMikdash. That's a tiny detail compared to the whole rest of the Torah. This is mechaper. The Sir Mishtaleach is mechaper for everything. And just a side point, the word scapegoat actually comes from the idea of a Sir Mishtaleach. The goat that's sent out, it escapes, so that became the word scape in scapegoat. It's good to mention to your friends and family on Yom Kippur or something like that. All right, so we have in our Mishnah here, we have a little bit of a discord in the sense that sometimes it sounds like Yom Kippur plays a role, sometimes not. But this is an interesting point. Even if it's only some of the time, Yom Kippur playing a role is really important, right? Because even in the time of the Mikdash, you bring the Korbanos themselves are not sufficient. Usually Korbanos themselves are sufficient, but for some reason, on Yom Kippur, there's a need for the day itself, according to at least Mishnah as it seems, we should read it. So everything we've said until now is based on our text of the Mishnah that we have, but as we're going to see, this is a little controversial. So let's go forward. And first of all, Rashi, this is sort of a minor point, but it spawns some larger points. Rashi on our Mishnah talks about the two categories. First, the Sir Nasa B'fnim, the Chatas brought inside, the goat for a Chatas brought inside, and here he doesn't mention anything about Yom Kippur helping, right? Just the Shiur is mechaper. That's what Rashi says. He seems to leave out the Yom Kippur part. And then on the next piece, Sir Nasa B'chutz, V'Yom HaKippurim mechaper. Then the next line, the outside Chatas, the goat for a Chatas, then he does say Yom Kippur participates. So this leads some Achronim to ask the question, Rashi, why are you being inconsistent? Why didn't you say it the first time? Say the first time Yom Kippur is a necessary component of the atonement. Why are you jumping in only the second time around? You leave it out the first time, you mention it the second time. That seems oddly inconsistent. So the Achronim have a couple of answers here. They're helpful for us, not just to answer this small question in Rashi, but to answer the larger question of what's going on here. So the Chassam Sofer, he asks the question, he quotes Rashi, he says, Ule'el, B'Sir Nasa B'fnim, Lo Pirish Rashi again. Rashi didn't say anything about Yom Kippur participating earlier. Why? Mishum the Pshita de Yom Gorim la Karban Shiavo. Obviously, you're only going to bring the Karban on Yom Kippur. This is the Sir Nasa B'fnim. You only bring a Chatas inside on Yom Kippur. You don't bring a Karban like that any other day of the year. Mashe Enkein jumping, Sir Nasa B'chutz Shuba Imam Musafim. We bring a Chatas outside in the courtyard every Yontif and on Rosh Chodesh, every Musaf. That's a pretty common thing. So the thing that's like a super specific Yom Kippur thing, it's obvious that Yom Kippur participates. He doesn't need to mention it. Something that's a more generic type of Karban, he needs to throw in that Yom Kippur participates. That's his first answer. It's sort of don't make a big deal out of this. It's not really, there's no difference here. But then he has another suggestion. Lule de mistafina. If I wasn't scared of suggesting something new, I would have thought the following, meaning it's usually when you want to say something without, taking responsibility for it. You say, throw this out as a suggestion. Maybe, I don't know. I'm scared to really say this. He says, maybe there are Shimon polygons there. Rav Shimon in the Mishnah, we didn't read it closely, but there's two different views in the Mishnah. He thinks maybe Rav Shimon argues, so maybe there's a machlokas in the Mishnah between the different opinions there as to whether the day actually works or not. And that's why we come back and we get into some of the details there. We distinguish between this Karban. Rashi needs to emphasize this Karban where there's a dispute. According to the Tanakama, Yom Kippur does participate. So here we have a first view, the Chassam Sofer's understanding of Rav Shimon in his theoretical position. There is one view that the day of Yom Kippur does not participate. Now, if we continue to the next source, the Merome Sadat, he's also going to suggest a different answer. So he says, right, so, and this is important, especially for how to read the lines in the Mishnah. He also asked the question on Rashi. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he says, what's the story with this line? Seir anasa b'chutz ve Yom Kippur mechaper. So I thought it meant, as Tali said, the Seir, the chatas, plus ve and Yom Kippur together are mechaper. He says, no, that's not how you should read it. He says that perish b'kol Mishnah the Yom Kippurim o Yom Kippurim be'atzmo. When we say that the goat, the Seir nasa b'thim is mechaper, the Yom Kippurim, it doesn't mean and, it doesn't mean you need both, it's or. So the Seir, the goat, or Yom Kippur, either one can be mechaper, either the day or the Karban. So you don't need both together. Really, it's either can do it, either or can do it instead of both, instead of needing both. So that's a very creative reading of the Mishnah. It doesn't sound like that's what the Mishnah is saying, but we do have this. Sometimes vi means or, actually pretty frequently. Right? We have like a knee-jerk reaction to translate vi as and sometimes that's true, but sometimes vi is or, and sometimes vi is just continuing the sentence. Right? It doesn't always work well to translate it as and. Fine. So that's the second view. According to this, so we have three possibilities now. Either the goat, the Seir alone is mechaper in the various cases, or the Seir plus Yom Kippur is necessary in each case, or it's an option, either the Seir or Yom Kippur. We have three possibilities so far. And really the Merome Sada isn't the first one to say this. The Ran, several hundred years earlier, says, Yesh Lomar de Rabbi, Yom Kippurim mechaper o Seir. This idea that the vi means o, right, and means or, that either the goat or Yom Kippur is mechaper, that already is out there. And fine, that's how he reads. This is a later sugya on the Mishnah, but that's how he reads the Mishnah, reads back into the Mishnah. So this idea of either or has a pretty good early pedigree. Just to quickly look at some other commentaries on the Mishnah, and then we'll take a few questions on this segment of the Shiur. The Tiferes Yisrael, the commentary on the Mishnah, says V'yom Kippurim atzmusos shel yom, the way we were reading it originally, the day itself, the very day itself is mechaper. And then he has this interesting point. What's the nafkamina? Like, when do you ever have the Karban on Yom Kippur without Yom Kippur? Like, why would it matter that Yom Kippur participates? And he has a suggestion that maybe tzarich sheyamin Yom Kippur mechaper. If you think one of the components of the atonement is the day itself, so if you are a Yom Kippur denier, if you don't believe that Yom Kippur actually works to atone, maybe you actually won't get the Kaphara, right? If it's a necessary component. If it's not a necessary component, then it doesn't matter what you think about it. That's his suggestion. Interesting point. But the main thing here is he's someone who explicitly says atzmuso shel yom, the day itself participates in the atonement. Fine. Here, and now we're going to look at some people who have a different girsa in our Mishnah, just to mix things up a bit. Right? Our Mishnah said vi, right? Seir nas b'fnim vi Yom Kippur mechaper, A and B. And some people said, well, maybe vi means or, so maybe it's A or B. But some people had just a different girsa entirely. So the Rid was in Italy. Sometimes he has different Masoras, he has different traditions. This is one such case. He says, Seir nasa b'chutz bi Yom Kippurim V'yom HaKippurim atzmo mo'elim HaKarban. So he does something very unusual here. We'll see, it'll make a bit more sense in a second. But he sounds very repetitive. The Seir Nas B'chutz that happens on Yom Kippur and Yom Kippur itself, meaning the day, are effective together, right? The carbon plus the day. So he makes it crystal clear that his vi doesn't just mean vi. I mean, it doesn't just mean or. It means and, that the two are working together, right? Because he spells out the carbon on Yom Kippur plus the day of Yom Kippur itself work together. Possibly what he was trying to avoid is people who quote our Mishnah and seem to have a different girsa, seem to have a girsa of not v'yom HaKippurim, but with a vav, but b'yom HaKippurim with a beis. And one such person seems to be the Rambam, who has this other girsa. The Seir Nas B'chutz, b'yom HaKippurim huchatas. Right, Rambam talks with a story that's brought b'yom HaKippurim on Yom Kippur is a chata. Similarly, the Meiri has that girsa of b'yom HaKippurim on Yom Kippur, this Shiur. So it sounds like they had it on the Mishnah. They didn't say vi, A and B, the goat and Yom Kippur. They had the goat brought on Yom Kippur. It's just describing when it's brought, b'yom HaKippurim, telling you the day that it's brought. Fine. So that's an important point in terms of girsa. And again, Rashi not only on our Mishnah in Schwarz that we were just reading, but also also that he says it earlier in the Mishnah too, b'yom HaKippurim, and that fits very well with his comment on the Mishnah in Yoma that we started with, source number 1, where he says the following: right? That most of that Mishnah is talking about nowadays. There's no avoda, there's no carbon. If there is a carbon, so the whole Mishnah, the whole discussion that we talked about last week about whether you need Chuva along with Yom Kippur or not, that's only without a Beis HaMikdash. If there is a Beis HaMikdash, you have the Sa'ir HaMishtaleach. Everything is this Kapparah. You get atonement for everything. No Chuva necessary. That's the Rambam's use. That's consistent with his girsa. His girsa of Seir Nas B'chutz or Rifnim Be Yom Kippurim, the one that happens to be brought in Yom Kippur. The day of Yom Kippur plays no role whatsoever. You don't need Chuva. You don't need Yom Kippur. As we said when we read this Mishnah, you don't need anything except for the Seir Mishtaleach. And as was mentioned, the Meiri also has this girsa. Right, so the Meiri, we can really spend a lot of time on this Meiri. Before we get to the Meiri, we'll spend a little bit of time in the Meiri now. And just bear with me here for a minute, because it's really cool how this will tie in with what we did last week. And I think many of you were here last week. If not, you'll pick it up quickly from this Meiri. He really emphasizes his point well. We didn't read this Meiri last week. This is the Meiri commenting on our Mishnah. Right, last week we looked at Meiri's in Yoma and then his Chibur on Chuva. Here, this is a totally different Meiri, but he's going to say he's going to be very consistent. So he says, he talks about the Mishnah, right, when we say that, it's sort of repetitive. When we say all the things that the Seir Mishtaleach takes care of, we're a little repetitive, intentional, unintentional, knowing, unknowing. In all these cases. So the Mishnah seems to say the Seir Mishtaleach is mechaper for everything. The Meiri comes in and says the Seir Mishtaleach works for everything if even without Chuva, if we're talking about minor sins. So a minor sin, maybe the Seir Mishtaleach works. Aval chamuros sayirim Chuva mechaperim. For a more severe sin, something more than like a basic asay or maybe a lav, anything more than that, you actually need Chuva. And this is consistent with the Meiri we saw last week, where he at every chance brought in Chuva as a necessary component. And then in the next case, he adds in extra words that the Mishnah doesn't have in his description. So he talks about in that case of Tuma, Seir Nas B'chutz, b'yom HaKippurim, notice the beis, not the vav, that's mechaper. Describes the carbon, mechaper lo ima Chuva. Those words are not in the Mishnah. The Meiri adds it in. The Seir Nas B'chutz on Yom Kippur is mechaper with Chuva. So think about this double move that he does, right? For those who know what a double move is. On the one hand, the Mishnah seems to say, Seir Nas B'chutz, v'yom HaKippurim, mechaper, right? It's the goat plus Yom Kippur together are mechaper. The Meiri says, wait. It doesn't say v'yom HaKippurim, it says bi Yom HaKippurim. So Yom Kippur is actually not relevant at all. Then he says, but by the way, the Mishnah doesn't say anything about this, but I'll tell you that Chuva, a totally different factor, is necessary, right? So you need to throw in, that's what he throws in Ima Chuva. So he both takes away the day of Yom Kippur, and he adds in the phenomenon, the necessary component of tshuva. And then the same later on, the Sir Mishleach is mechaper imat tshuva hashlema. He throws in full tshuva as allowing the Sir Mishleach to work. And as we saw last week, as he says in Chibur Tshuva, the Sir Mishleach works not because of anything magical or inherent about the Sir Mishleach, but because the Sir Mishleach inspires people to do full tshuva, tshuva hashlema, as he calls it here, or tshuva gemura, as he said in the source from last week. And then again, he throws in for good measure, imat tshuva, at the end of his description of this Mishnah. So the Meiri is very consistent, tshuva, tshuva, tshuva all the way, and important for our purposes as well, Yom Kippur plays no role. It's the korban brought on Yom Kippur. It's not the korban brought plus the day of Yom Kippur. Now, if you look in the best manuscript we have on the Mishnah, the Kaufman manuscript, source number 14 here, you actually find something interesting. We basically saw two different girsahs of the Mishnah. The girsah of Yom Kippurim and the girsah of Yom Kippurim, with a vav or with a beis. The Kaufman has a totally different girsah entirely. So he says, in this scenario, Ein ba yedi basof, Seir anasa bifnim, Yom HaKippurim, Tole. He doesn't say vav, he doesn't say a beis. He has neither. He just says the Seir anasa bifnim, Yom Kippur is Tole. So it's very confusing because grammatically this doesn't really work. But it could be that this is, the people who think that it's not A plus B. It's not Seir anasa bifnim Yom HaKippurim. Maybe they have some support, at least from this manuscript, the Kaufman manuscript, that maybe the original Girsa didn't have a vav, although it's not clear that it had anything, and it's not clear what that would mean exactly, but at least that may be a support for Rambam and Meiri. Just quickly to sum up our findings, our analysis of this Mishnah. So it sounded like from the Mishnah that Yom Kippur played a role in Kaphara in at least some of the Korbanos. On the other hand, by the Sar Mishaleach, it seems to not be mentioned. And according to some people, Rav Shimon disagrees and doesn't think you need the day. And according to some people, the vav doesn't mean and, it means or. And according to some people, the vav is not really there at all. It's really a beis. And really maybe, if anything, Yom Kippur plays no role, but maybe tshuva plays a role, as the Meiri suggests. So we have some competing factors here, right? What seems straightforward, that the Korbanos work with the day of Yom Kippur. On second glance, it looks like there's a lot of reasons to think that maybe not, that maybe Yom Kippur doesn't play a role here. So Adkan, that's the analysis of this Mishnah. It's very important. It's maybe the primary source. There's a lot of different directions that we've seen here. But let's pause now if there are any questions. And after the questions, we'll move towards sort of the broader ramifications of this by looking at other sugyas, sort of moving to a more historical sort of analysis. But first, any questions or thoughts, ideas? We'll stop share for a minute. Everyone's welcome. Zoe.
Hi. I'm curious. I don't know if you'll be able to answer this. I'm curious about the transmission method here of like, it seems very clear some people have one version of this and others have another. Do you think that this is a written source that gets sort of different written sources get passed? Or because you noted like in the earliest written source we have, it doesn't make sense. Do you think people are just filling that in? Like, do we know what that might be?
Okay, so it's a great question. This is like you can ask this question anytime there's like different textual variants, right? How did you get from point A to point B? I think in this case, I'm not fully sure for some of the reasons you mentioned, but I think if the options are a beis and a vav, they don't really look alike graphically, but they do sound alike, right?
Yeah, that was one part of my question, yeah.
Right, so it seems if you like, forced me to make a guess, I would say most likely there was some confusion between vav and beis, just based on the sound, the oral, A-U-R-A-L, confusion in people hearing it. How do you explain Kaufman? That's really confusing, right? Because it is the best manuscript generally for Mishnah. It doesn't read well at all. So that they had different Masoras and they said like, let's just leave it blank. Is it that they had some odd, they had this weird girsa, sometimes, lectio difficilia, or sometimes the weirder text is actually the right one because, if this was wrong, how did it show up here? The best explanation is that it's actually the original girsa, and for whatever reason, people, hyper-corrected in various ways. So it's hard to know for sure. That's like, a historian, a philologist question, right? It doesn't really matter at the end of the day for our purposes. We're just trying to understand the different views here. We're trying to reconstruct the proper Mishnah. We don't really have the possibility of doing that for sure. And anyways, as generally, we understand the Mishnah in light of the commentaries on the Mishnah. That's sort of the way the Mishnah is preserved and explained going forward in Jewish tradition, right? So, and we've seen there's a variety of views. So whatever the original text of the Mishnah was, it's pretty clear that there's a lot of ways of understanding the Mishnah today. But again, great question, and I don't know of a good answer. I don't know how one would get a good answer. Riva.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, for those that say that teshuva is a component of the Kaphara process, what would there be like some kind of halachic ramification? Like it's kind of very difficult to define. Like what kind of measure would you have for this? Like, is it a measure of how much teshuva you do or like the quality? And like, are we able to read into what the Meiri would think about that?
Yeah, so, okay, so it's an interesting question. What's the measure? What's the shiur? How much tshuva is necessary? So I think this is a case where, even though we do have, as we're reading, we have halachic sources talking about what yields Kaphara, what yields atonement, and what doesn't. It doesn't really, there's no practical ramification, meaning it's not like, if you ask your rabbi, did I get Kaphara on this or not? They won't say, oh, you got Kaphara, therefore you can host our shul luncheon this week, or you didn't get Kaphara, you can't, right? It's sort of, that's a metaphysical realm that at the end of the day, God decides really what happens. We're doing our best to understand it, but I don't think there's a real practical ramification here. But I think the reason we have these discussions, Chazal want us to understand, when do you get Kaphara? Not the most practical ramification is, do you still need to, deal with the Avera? Do you still need to try to fix it? So how to do tshuva and like the process there, which I think is more of a qualitative description than a quantitative description. The Rambam has a lot to say about it based on Gemaras. There are other people, Shari Tshuva, and Ben Yona. So there's a lot of material out there, but I don't think there's really a quantitative answer. Like this much tshuva is enough. You need to do tshuva, however tshuva works, and there's different views on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. Any other questions? All right, so let's jump back in to our texts. Just going to put back on the screen share. So we're going to now look at a different sugya that I think is a bit more explicitly historical, at least once we get to the Rishonim, and then we're going to try to piece this all together. And it's not so easy. There's a lot of moving parts here, not in this case, not animal parts, but just conceptual parts. So source 15 is the Gemara in Schwarz Yud Gimel commenting on the Mishnah, and it's actually talking about Rabbi that we know and love from last week. The position of Rabbi, that at least it sounded like it was saying, you get Kaphara with the day of Yom Kippur, with no tshuva nowadays. Tshuva is not necessary. The day of Yom Kippur itself cleanses all your sins. We discussed this at some length last time. So the Gemara says, Umoda Rebbe bekaris the Yoma. It must be that Rebbe agrees, that Rebbe backs off of his position, that all you need is Kaphara in a case of kares the Yoma, violating kares on Yom Kippur, let's say eating on Yom Kippur, or doing malacha on Yom Kippur. In such a case, presumably, Rebbe would admit that you don't get automatically atoned for by the day of Yom Kippur itself without any tshuva, and you're off scot-free. Why? The ilo temahachi, if you don't say that Rebbe backs off in that case, kares Yom Kippurim le Rebbe leislei. When would you ever get the punishment of kares for violating Yom Kippur? Right? The Torah says, anyone who doesn't suffer, doesn't fast on Yom Kippur gets kares, gets excision. But how would that ever work if Rebbe held that, let's say you eat on Yom Kippur, and then, well, it's Yom Kippur, so you have your sin atoned for. You don't even need to do tshuva. Then you eat something else, and then your sin gets atoned. So when would you ever get kares on Yom Kippur? The Torah says you get kares. What's that? What's the pasuk talking about? It must be, says the Gemara, that Rebbe backs off of his view and thinks, usually for averos you did before Yom Kippur, no matter how bad they are, they get cleaned up, they get cleansed without tshuva. But an avera you did on Yom Kippur, if you eat on Yom Kippur, that will be an avera that you can't get rid of, maybe only with tshuva. So that's the Gemara's presumption, and now we object to that. Alamalo, why not? Why do you need to say that? What's the issue? Let's say you ate at night, and then you died before the morning. because you haven't gotten to daytime yet to get Kapparah. The Gemara here is assuming that you only get Kapparah, according to Rabbi, through the day of Yom Kippur during the daytime, not the nighttime, which is not at all obvious. There's a little dispute around that, but that's the assumption here. So if so, the case where you get kares is if you eat at night and you don't reach the daytime, you get kares for that. Ella ema kares di'imama l'Rebbe leislei. Okay, fine. So you can get kares if you eat at night, but you can't. In a case where you ate on Yom Kippur during the day, you wouldn't get kares. That sounds really weird. It doesn't sound like that's what the pasuk is saying. The pasuk says if you don't fast, you get kares. It doesn't say nighttime. Alama lo mishpachas la de'achal umtza v'chan keumis. Well, no. Even if you eat by day on Yom Kippur, you can still get kares in a case where you eat a bone, you choke on it and die. So if you eat and die immediately, then there's no time for the Kaphara to jump in to take effect, and you wouldn't get atonement. You would get kares instead. Inami you eat right until nightfall, right until the end of Yom Kippur. There was no time for you to get Kaphara. So this Gemara is fascinating for a lot of reasons. It's like sort of a cool logical game to try to figure out what the scenario is where you can get Kaphara, or you can get kares without, and the Kaphara doesn't work. For our purposes, it's important because it sets up the following question of Tosfos. That's going to really blow this whole sugya open. Tosfos says the avad samach l'shkias achama. This idea, if you eat right before nightfall, the day of Yom Kippur won't atone for you, right? Because you don't have any time for Yom Kippur to kick in. So Tosfos is going to say, okay, we've been thinking about nowadays, but what if we think about in the time of the Beis Hamikdash? Aval la'achar shiluach Zuckier lo matzi l'ukma shehu mechaper kol hayom. So Tosfos, there's an implicit question here. They say, wait, I have another scenario, right? We have like 3 different scenarios in our Gemara. What about a scenario where you say you can eat and get kares on Yom Kippur because you ate after they brought the Shiur HaMishtaleach? You get Kaphara in Yom Kippur from the scapegoat, from the Shiur HaMishtaleach. We saw that in the Mishnah on Daf Beis. But if they already brought the Shiur HaMishtaleach, it's too late for you to get Kaphara. So he says, that's his implicit question. He says, you can't say that because Shu Mechaper Kol Hayom. Actually, the Shiur HaMishtaleach, let's say they bring it at 3 p.m. and then you eat at 4 p.m. on Yom Kippur, the Shiur HaMishtaleach actually is Mechaper for you in the future. Now Tosfos is going to have a problem with this. Tosfos says, right? Does that sound weird to you? Can a korban be mechaper on the future? Right? You go to the Beis Hamikdash, you bring a korban chatas, you say, tomorrow I'm probably going to do an avera, so this chatas now, I'm pre-gaming the kapara, right? I should get the chatas now to work for tomorrow when I do the avera. That doesn't work. You have to bring, the whole point of a korban to be mechaper is it's to fix something you did wrong previously. So how can you say the Shiur HaMishtaleach works for the fact that you're going to eat later, right? You can't, there's no retroactive kapara. What does that even mean? Right? People understand the question? Right? He says, we can't say, don't say a scenario where you eat after the Shiur HaMishtaleach because the Shiur HaMishtaleach is mechaper afterwards. How can it be mechaper after it's already brought? He has 3 answers. The first answer, Shani Shiur HaMishtaleach, B'chsiv bei, ki vayom hazeh yichaper aleichem l'tarsum kol chatosechem, mashma, b'kol yom mechaper. The Shiur HaMishtaleach is different. Usually, yes, Korbanos are only mechaper on the past, not on the future. But the Shiur HaMishtaleach, because the pasuk says ki vayom hazeh, right, on this day, therefore it works all day. Meaning the Shiur HaMishtaleach can actually work on the future. That's answer 1. Answer number 2, inami hayom atzmo below Shiur HaMishtaleach mechaper ksas. Or answer number 2, no. The Shiur, even in such a case, right, the Shiur is brought at 3. You eat on Yom Kippur at 4, so you're not going to get kapara from the Shiur HaMishtaleach, but you still will get kapara from the day of Yom Kippur. Ksas, you'll get partial kapara. The enkan kares gomer, you won't get the full kares. So that wouldn't be a good answer in the Gemara. That's answer number 2. And then answer number 3, the Yesh Mefarshim, the Yom Kippur and below Shiur HaMishtaleach mechaper legamre. Maybe Yom Kippur alone is fully mechaper. So this is like the option we saw before, that either the Korbanos, in this case the Shiur HaMishtaleach, or Yom Kippur as a day is mechaper. That's the third answer. But what's going on in the first answer? Could someone explain to me what's the logic here of you bring your Shiur HaMishtaleach at 3 o'clock, the person eats on Yom Kippur at 4 o'clock, that avera is magically taken care of by the Shiur HaMishtaleach that was brought in the past. How does that work? And what's his proof? He says the pasuk says ki vayom hazeh yichaper. How does that actually explain anything? How does that answer the question? Any thoughts? Yeah, Zoe?
It seems to be it seems to be a continuation of the idea that like there's something just about the day of Yom Kippur that makes it exceptional to any other day. And so like that's what I keep thinking about in all the examples that you're bringing of like I'm trying to think if there are other examples of just like this day is sort of this like very unusual one for like whatever reasons, in this case for Kapparah. So it seems to be like you need to do the actions of Yom Kippur to fully get all the benefit of Yom Kippur, but then it lasts for like magically through the day. My question is like, what happens if you eat like right at like sunset or something like that?
Like the
Seems
Gemara
very problematic. Yeah.
The Gemara says if you eat at sunset, then it won't help you, right? Because the day
Yeah.
itself doesn't get a second in, for itself. But yeah, I think Zoe, I think you're saying that you're going the direction I was going to go in, which is it sounds like it's not when Tosa says like, oh, the Shiur Shalech magically works afterwards because the pasuk says Ki vayom hazeh. What he's really saying is there's an integration here. It's not the Shiur Shalech magically works on the future. It's the Kapparah of the Shiur Shalech is very much integrated with the day of Yom Kippur. They're working together. This is the case. This is the case of the Shiur Shalech working with Yom Kippur, and not just like A plus B in a quantitative sense, but there's a fundamental integration between the two factors, right? Yom Kippur and the Shiur work together, integrate together to the Kaphara. That's answer one. Answer two is that the day itself, they sort of work independently. The Shiur is mechaper fully. If you don't have that, the day is mechaper partially. And the third answer sounds like the Shiur is mechaper fully, and if you don't have that, the day is mechaper fully. You have two, each one is sufficient, two sufficient mechaperim. We're going to skip a couple sources for reasons of time, and let's look at the Rambam in Hilchos Chuva. There's some translation on the bottom. If you have the handout, you can look ahead if you want. We'll start at Halacha Beis here. This Rambam is also going to be like a super surprising and interesting Rambam, right? Because what have we been saying until now? Basically, let's just take a step back before we read the Rambam, right? So what are the models that we have for how Yom Kippur works when there are Korbanos? Either Yom Kippur works just through the carbon itself does everything, the day does nothing, or Yom Kippur works as an alternative, or the day or the carbon are two alternatives, or there's some integration between the two, as we just saw in Tosfos, right? The day works with the carbon because the Shiur can work on the future. Presumably there's like a fusion. There's a Shiur Yom fusion going on. Those are all models, and when you think about how those models work, what happens, let's say, on the view, well, let's go through them. The view that either Yom Kippur or the day is enough. Nowadays, we don't have the carbon. Either Yom Kippur or the carbon is enough. We don't have the carbon. What changed nowadays? How is Kapparah now different than Kapparah then? Doesn't have to be different at all, right? It's the same thing. It's just you have only one option instead of two, right? But you get to the same place. On the other hand, if you have the view that the carbon does all the Kapparah, and now we don't have the carbon, but we still have the day, how would that work? A couple of ways, right? But somehow the day is standing in for the Kapparah. And if you think that there's some fusion between the two, also something's changed. We don't have the full set of Korbanos, but at least we have the day itself to do something. But in all of these models, the question is to what degree the day of Yom Kippur stands in for the Korbanos, right? That's what everyone said until now. Let's read the Rambam. Hilchos Chuva, Halacha, Perek Aleph, Halacha Beis. This is right at the beginning of Hilchos Chuva. What is Chuva? The Rambam says Chuva is focused on vidui. You do vidui in Korbanos. You do vidui when you do averos other times. And then he jumps in. Sir Mishaleach. Lefishu Kapparah al Kol Yisrael. Right? The scapegoat atones for all of Israel. Kohen Gadol Misvade Alav. Kohen Gadol says a big vidui al Lashon Kol Yisrael for everyone. Shemar Misvade Alav. As Kol Avodos Bnei Israel. Fine. What is it mechaper for? Sir Mishaleach. Mechaper al kol averos Shabbat Torah. We saw this in the Mishnah. Hakalos v'achamuros. Ben shavar zada, ben shavar shgaga, ben shahodlo, ben shalo hadlo. Hakol miskaper b'simur shleich. All averos, basically in all scenarios, are atoned by the simur shleich. That's from the Mishnah. What does the Rambam sneak in here? Behusha asa tshuva. Now the Gemara discusses that a little bit later on. That's not in the Mishnah. The Rambam builds on that Gemara, and it's not clear from the Gemara how we paskin. The Rambam says we paskin. It works if you did tshuva. If you didn't do tshuva, you're not going to get too much out of your simur shleich. If you don't do tshuva and you only have the scapegoat, that'll only atone for the minor sins. We saw this earlier in the Meiri. He describes what exactly they are. That's in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. Sir Mishtaleach is mechaper for everything with tshuva, and without tshuva, it's mechaper for minor sins. So first of all, the Rambam was building in a big tshuva there, but what's the biggest mechaper? What's mechaper for everything in the time of the Beis HaMikdash? The Sir Mishtaleach, right? And nowadays, Bizman Hazeh, continues the Rambam, She'ein Beis HaMikdash Kayim, we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. Ve'ein Lanu Mizbach Kapparah, we don't have a Mizbech to do atonement. We don't have the Sir Mishtaleach anymore. The Sir Mishtaleach used to be the main mechaper. Nowadays, without that, we have, fill in the blank, what would everyone we've seen until now say? We don't have the Sir Mishtaleach. What do we have?
Teshuva.
Well, you're going with the Rambam. But
Yeah.
anyway, what Tosfos would have said is we have the day of Yom Kippur. We don't have the Karban. We have the day. The Yom fills in. But the Rambam, shockingly, says, Ein Mizbach Kapparah, Ein Sham Ella Tshuva. All we have is Tshuva. And now the Rambam has a line that does not, built on other sources, but he's trying to basically fill in what we said before. Sir Mishtaleach, mechaper al kol averos. And now he says, HaTshuva, mechaperes al kol averos. Just like the Sir Mishtaleach used to atone for everything, that's replaced not by the day of Yom Kippur, but by Tshuva. Tshuva is the new replacement in the Rambam's view of Rambam's Chiddush. Tshuva is the replacement for the Sir Mishtaleach, not the day of Yom Kippur. And then the Rambam, of course, this is the beginning of Hilchos Tshuva. The Rambam is trying to show the power of Tshuva. Tshuva today is the number one mechaper, right? Whereas it used to be the Sir L'Azazel. Nowadays we don't have that. What steps up? What becomes the new number one? Tshuva. Afilu Rasha kol yama v'asa tshuva achronein maskir l'shum davar merisho. You're a Rasha. You're evil to your whole life. You did everything wrong. You do tshuva at the end of your life. We forget about your whole past. And shenemar rishas harasho yikasho ba yom shu merisho. We forget about your evil past. The atzmo Yom Kippur and Chuva, right? The Rambam sort of as an afterthought almost. After talking about the power of tshuva, tshuva is now the ultimate mechaper because we don't have the Sir Mishtaleach. It can be mechaper for everything, and he gives a whole story about someone who does tshuva at the end of a life of sin, and then it's like, oh, by the way, the atzmo Yom Kippur mechaper, la shavim, right? The day of Yom Kippur itself is mechaper if you do tshuva, but the day of Yom Kippur is very much lower on the hierarchy than tshuva. Whereas I think for everyone we've seen until now, for the views of Tosfos and for others that we didn't have a chance to read inside, it's pretty clear we don't have the Korbanot of Yom Kippur. What steps in? The day of Yom Kippur steps in. It's perfect. And we actually, in the first year, if you recall, the Sifra essentially said that. It said, the Pasuk says, Ki b'zeh yichaper aleichem, b'korbanos, right? With this whole description of all the Korbanos, there you get Kaphara. Why did the Torah say Ki by Yom Hazeh? It shows that even if you don't have Korbanos, the day is mechaper. The Sifra very clearly says the day stands in for the Korbanos. Tosfos, all of his shitos seem to say, well, we had in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, we had Korbanos. We didn't. The day played maybe a minor role, maybe no role, maybe an alternate role. Without Korbanos, the day steps up and plays the full role. Rambam says no. It's not about the day of Yom Kippur. It's about tshuva. Tshuva really steps up. The day of Yom Kippur plays a minor role. It's mechaper for those who do tshuva. And if you recall, the way that the Meiri formulated this point, building on this Rambam, was he said, what does it mean that doing tshuva is tole, and then until you get to Yom Kippur when you get the Kaphara? He says that's the true fulfillment of the tshuva only comes about on Yom Kippur. But Yom Kippur is just a way of finishing off the process of tshuva, because the Meiri read this Rambam. The Meiri said tshuva is the main mechaper. The Meiri actually took it further than the Rambam. But the idea of the role that the day of Yom Kippur plays is very much secondary to that of tshuva. And again, this is the Rambam against many other people. So I think we're short on time. Let's open it up for some questions. I think next time we'll be able to build a bit further and really figure out exactly different views on this historical progression, what changed historically. Again, we have a basic point here of is Yom Kippur, are the Korbanos Yom Kippur replaced by the day or by tshuva? But there's several more questions we need to ask, including why the change happened and the details of how it works. How can the day stand in for the Korbanos? How can tshuva stand in for the Korbanos? In what capacity exactly? And various other things. So we'll save that for next week, I think. For now, any questions or suggestions, thoughts, ideas, chidushim on
can I ask a question?
Sure.
So for those that say that okay, in the past it was the Korbanot and nowadays it's just the day. So essentially, like we just receive Kaphara by not doing anything, just like by like Yom Kippur happening. And like I'm struggling to understand why anyone would say that. Like to me, the Rambam's opinion makes much more sense.
Okay, great. So last week we discussed the relationship between Chuva and Yom Kippur, and we discussed the view of the Rambam and the Meiri on one side, that at the end of the day, Chuva is the primary factor between those two, and we just saw that again in the Rambam and in the Meiri for that matter. We discussed that against the view of the Tosfos, Tosfos Yantif, Tosfos Rush, and others, that essentially the main factor is Yom Kippur. Maybe it's the only factor. Maybe Yom Kippur does everything on its own. Maybe you need some integration. You're now asking, what's the logic for the view that Yom Kippur is magically mechaper and you don't even need to do tshuva? How is that right? How does that make sense? How is that moral? So the theory we suggested last time, based on what we saw in, I think it was Rav Shimshon Paul Hirsch, I think the Minchas Chinuch says similarly, is that Yom Kippur is fundamentally about chesed. It's a day of divine grace where God says, I will grant you atonement for your sins. I'll give you a clean slate. You don't deserve it, but I'm the sort of person, or being, I should say, if it's God, right? I'm the sort of being that gives things for free. Just like kings, right? You let someone off for their crimes. So this is parallel, right? The King of Kings lets us off for our sins every year. And I think this speaks to the question of what Kapparah is. What does it mean to get atonement for something? Can you really clean your slate? Can you really reverse history? Can you change the past? Does that work in some naturalistic way? Or that's really impossible. And the only way it could ever work is by some miracle or some act of divine grace to erase the past, to give us something we don't deserve. And I think that's the basis of the competing view, the non-Maimonidean view, which sounds like, based on the Sugya last time, there's a lot of support for it in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, in several Rishonim. Seems to be a very main view that Yom Kippur itself plays the major role, at least does half the work of Kaphara. And I think this is an understanding of Kaphara that can be consistent with that. I think it's a bit less it's a bit less rationalistic. It's a bit more the idea of grace, or the idea of something happening automatically without any deservingness or any desert on your part. Maybe a bit harder to swallow, but I think this can actually help us. Learning these things helps us appreciate that idea a bit better, even though it doesn't. It's not the most modern of conceptions.
Right. So then, why would people? I don't know. Nowadays, practically, why would people like go to shul on Yom Kippur, or like why would people do anything?
Okay, great. Tosfos has a similar formulation. They say, if Yom Kippur is mechaper on its own, how come the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed? Right? Shouldn't they have just gone Kapparah every year? You never get that many averos. So you're asking similarly, why should we even try? So first of all, it's not, that's not clear that that's the view is accepted. Number one. Number two, and hopefully we'll get to this one of the next 2 weeks, there's a whole discussion as to whether there's really no strings attached, no conditions, or whether Yom Kippur needs certain things in place to work. So even if you don't need tshuva, you might need the fact that you're marking the day in some way, or that you're fasting on the day, or refraining from malacha. That may be a necessary condition. And I would say, even if you think that's not necessary, even if you thought the Yom Kippur itself magically does everything, tshuva plays no role, marking the day plays no role, there still is a mitzvah to do tshuva, right? We're still obligated to do tshuva, both because we want to do the right thing going forward, and just there's a mitzvah of tshuva, according to many Rishonim. So I think, even though there's no reward, it's something can still be obligatory, right? So I'd say that would be the answer I'd give to your question, but it's a fair question. Again, as I said, it's somewhat parallel to Tosfos' question.
Right. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay. Well, we still have a lot more to do on this topic, so we'll get into it a bit further next time. But for now, I think we made some important first steps in understanding the difference between Kapparah of Yom Kippur in the time of the Beis Hamikdash and the Kapparah of Yom Kippur today. Again, thinking about the Korbanos, thinking about the day itself, thinking about the role of tshuva in this process. So hopefully we'll all get a chance to learn this sugya a bit more next week, and find some further exciting conceptual possibilities here. Everyone should have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks, Rav Shlomo.
All right, thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing everyone back here next week at the same time for the next session of this class. You can also find more of our classes online at drisha.org/classes. I just put the link to that in the chat. So thank you, Rabbi Zuckier. Thank you all for being here. Shabbat Shalom and see you soon.